The first shells came at dawn, shrieking through the pale gray sky like demons loosed from some old nightmare, and the earth beneath the soldiers' boots shook as if the planet itself were recoiling from the violence. Men scrambled from half-dug trenches, their rifles clattering against the mud walls, their mouths open in curses or prayers that no one could hear over the thunder of explosions. The air filled with dirt, dust, and acrid smoke, and every blast ripped more of the ground apart, turning the battlefield into a shifting landscape of craters and broken stone. For a moment, command and training vanished. There was only survival, bodies pressing against whatever cover they could find, hands clutching helmets as shards of steel whistled past. The artillery did not fall in any rhythm that men could predict. It came in waves, random, vicious, designed not only to kill but to shred nerves and dissolve any hope of order. Communication lines were already cut, their cables mangled by the first bombardments, and runners sent to deliver orders never returned. Radios crackled with static or screamed fragments of words drowned beneath the roar. It was chaos in its purest form, and men who had thought themselves hardened by months of skirmishes discovered what it meant to be truly helpless before a storm of fire. Through the smoke and ruin she moved. At first no one noticed her. She was a shadow gliding between shattered walls, a figure in mud-stained uniform that seemed no different from 100 others. But she carried herself with a calmness that did not belong to the battlefield, her eyes sharp, her steps unhurried even when the ground erupted within meters of where she walked. Where others curled in terror, she remained upright, scanning the horizon as if she were listening for a pattern in the noise, searching for the language hidden beneath the thunder. To those few who glimpsed her, she seemed unreal, like some apparition conjured by the madness of the bombardment. She paused at a crater where 3 wounded men clung to life, bandaged hastily with strips of cloth, and without hesitation she knelt, adjusted a tourniquet, pressed a vial of morphine into a trembling hand, and then rose again, her face set toward the distant hills from which the artillery fire rained. Her purpose was not survival. She was hunting. Another barrage fell, closer now, the shells striking in arcs that suggested a deliberate tightening of the noose around their scattered defenses. Entire sections of trench collapsed, swallowing men alive. Screams mingled with the crack of collapsing timber supports. The command post, once a hub of shouted orders and frantic scribbling on maps, was a ruin of splintered wood and burning paper, its officers either dead or buried. The front was collapsing in real time, yet she walked straight into the thick of it, past stunned soldiers who stared after her as though she were insane. She carried no rifle. Strapped across her back was something heavier, covered in a canvas wrap, and at her side a compact case of instruments. A young corporal tried to stop her, his face smeared with soot, shouting that it was suicide to head toward the shellfire. She did not even turn her head, only lifted one hand in a gesture that silenced him before he realized he had obeyed it without thought. When she disappeared into the haze again, he whispered to his comrades that he had seen death pass them by, and they believed him. She found her vantage point at the edge of the ruined village, where the broken spire of a church jutted above the smoke like a blackened finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. From here, she could see the flashes in the far hills, faint but distinct, the mouths of the guns that were tearing her people apart. She crouched, laying her case on the ground, unfastening the straps with deliberate care even as the ground quivered beneath the rain of steel. Inside were instruments of mathematics and precision. Range finders, maps scrawled with elevations, a compact radio tuned to frequencies that still crackled with life. She spread them out before her like a priest arranging relics upon an altar. The weapon across her back came free with a smooth practiced motion, and when she unwrapped it, the mud-streaked cloth fell away to reveal the long barrel and gleaming optics of a counter-battery rifle unlike any standard-issue armament. It was a creation born from her own designs, forged for one purpose only, to silence the thunder of artillery with its own echo. Her hands moved swiftly, assembling, calibrating, aligning. Around her the war howled, but in her head there was only stillness, a clarity as sharp as the edge of glass. Each flash on the horizon was a signal, and she read them as others read words. The enemy had their patterns, their rhythms hidden in the apparent chaos, and she had studied them for months, memorizing the angles of their hills, the positions from which their barrels could rise to arc shells this far into her lines. She breathed steadily, eyes fixed on the glass, adjusting by degrees until the faint blur of a gun emplacement sharpened into clarity. Men moved around it like ants, feeding the beast its endless hunger for shells. She marked it in her notebook, sketched the angle, measured distance against elevation, and then shifted her aim to the next flash. One by one she captured them, committing their locations into the silent ledger that would decide whether her comrades lived or died. Sweat traced lines down her temples, but her hands did not falter. She knew she would have one chance only. The enemy would not stop unless forced, and to force them she would need to strike with precision so absolute that their gunners would believe death itself had turned against them. She finished her calculations as another shell landed near enough to shower her with dirt. Her jaw clenched, but she did not look away. Instead, she adjusted the rifle's scope, dialed in the corrections and whispered numbers into her radio. Somewhere behind her, men still crouched in broken trenches, despair gnawing at their hearts, yet her voice cut through the static, calm and unwavering, a voice that carried command even though no rank insignia glittered on her collar. Coordinates left her lips like verdicts. She did not plead for reinforcements or mercy, she dictated targets. The artillery storm had brought chaos, but chaos was a language she had mastered. Now it was her turn to speak. The first shot broke the rhythm of the storm. It was not the thunder of artillery or the ragged burst of rifle fire but a single crack that sliced cleanly through the noise, sharp and purposeful, a sound that demanded attention. Soldiers in the trenches lifted their heads instinctively, uncertain of what they had heard. At that same instant, far on the ridge where the enemy guns roared, one of the flashes vanished in a bloom of smoke and sparks. For a heartbeat, the artillery stuttered, its cadence disrupted. Then it resumed, but the men on the ground had noticed. Something had changed. The storm was no longer absolute. Somewhere in the haze, someone had struck back. And though they did not yet know who or how, that sliver of defiance carried through the ranks like a spark racing through dry grass. She reloaded swiftly, her fingers moving with mechanical efficiency, the long brass casing ejecting into the dirt beside her. She did not celebrate, did not allow herself even the twitch of a smile. One gun silenced was nothing if the rest continued their work. Adjusted her scope, shifted her angle a fraction, calculated wind against distance, and breathed slowly until her heartbeat no longer rattled the sight. Another flash lit the horizon, another muzzle vomiting fire and steel. She traced the trajectory backward, fixed her crosshairs on the faint outline of the barrel. The rifle kicked against her shoulder and the second gun erupted. Its crew scattered, some consumed in the explosion, others staggering through the smoke like men who had awoken to find themselves in hell. She whispered another set of numbers into the radio, her voice steady, and behind her lines the few artillery pieces they still possessed coughed back into life, guided by her precision. For the first time since dawn, their fire did not land blindly, it struck true. Word began to spread. The corporal who had watched her pass now shouted above the din, pointing toward the horizon where explosions marked the sudden silencing of enemy guns. "It's her," he cried, though he did not know her name. "Someone's cutting them down." Men lifted their heads higher, emboldened by the sight, and though the shells still rained, they no longer crouched like prey waiting for the end. A strange energy coursed through the trenches, a flicker of hope stronger than morphine, steadier than command. They could feel the balance shifting even if only slightly. They had been drowning, but now there was a hand, invisible but undeniable, pulling them toward the surface. The enemy noticed. Their remaining guns shifted, not toward the trenches this time but toward the church spire that jutted like a broken tooth against the skyline. They had seen the impossible accuracy, traced the counterfire, and realized that death was stalking them from that ruin. The next barrage was not random, it was aimed. Shells crashed around her position, shattering stone, toppling what remained of the walls. Dust engulfed her, choking, blinding, and for a moment the world became nothing but concussion and flying debris. She pressed herself flat, body curled around her weapon, mind calculating even as instinct screamed to flee. The ground bucked and one beam of the church collapsed inches from her, scattering sparks. Still she held on. When the barrage paused, she rolled to her knee, wiped grit from her scope and reacquired her target. Her lungs burned, but her eyes were unshaken. They wanted her dead, which meant they had finally understood her threat. That was enough to keep her steady. She fired again and a third gun folded into silence. This time she heard it. The cheer of soldiers carried faintly across the battlefield, ragged but unmistakable. They had seen the strike, recognized the precision, and their voices rose above the thunder for the first time all morning. It was not a roar of victory, not yet, but the fragile beginning of defiance. To men who had thought themselves abandoned, who had felt the sky itself turn against them, her counterfire was more than survival. It was proof that the enemy could bleed. That artillery, for all its terror, could be broken. And in that proof was the seed of resistance. Her concentration did not waver, but inside she felt the weight of every heartbeat. Each calculation demanded perfection, and perfection under fire was bought with fragments of her strength. Her shoulders ached from recoil, her eyes burned from smoke, her ears rang with endless concussion, but she would not stop. She had trained for this, built herself into the weapon that the moment required. Her past was filled with nights of study, years of failure, endless adjustments until the rifle in her hands became not merely a tool but an extension of her will. She had vowed that when the day came she would be ready. And now, amid the chaos of collapsing lines, that vow burned within her stronger than fear. The enemy gunners grew desperate. They began firing erratically, some guns abandoning their careful arcs to unleash shells wildly into the countryside. It was the panic of men who had believed themselves untouchable and now found death creeping into their ranks. Each time she silenced another weapon, the storm grew weaker, the chaos less absolute. Her comrades behind the lines pressed forward, reorganizing, finding courage in the breathing space she carved for them. Officers who had been buried in despair now raised their voices again, barking orders, rallying the scattered defenders. The battlefield, once a place of collapse, stirred with the faint but undeniable rhythm of resistance. She paused only once, crouched amid broken stone, her chest heaving, her fingers brushing the scarred barrel of her rifle as if to steady it. For an instant she closed her eyes. Not in weakness, not in surrender, but in focus. She imagined the storm stopping, the silence that would follow when the last gun fell quiet. She imagined her comrades walking upright again, no longer cowering under the weight of steel. She imagined victory, not the kind that blazed with banners, but the quieter kind where survival itself was triumph. Then she opened her eyes, fixed them once more on the horizon, and prepared to fire again. The artillery had brought chaos. Her counterfire would bring its end. The sun climbed higher, though no warmth reached the ground. Smoke blotted out its light, turning the battlefield into a dim twilight where shadows and men blurred together. The artillery storm had lost its fury, reduced now to uneven bursts as more guns fell silent under her precision. But the enemy had not abandoned their rage. If they could not outshoot her, they would hunt her. Across the hills, movement shifted, trucks rolling, squads detaching, men scurrying like insects disturbed from their nest. The distant flashes no longer came from stationary barrels. Some of the guns were being dragged away, repositioned, hidden behind slopes that shielded them from her line of sight. She recognized the tactic instantly. They were not retreating, they were preparing a trap. They feared her, and fear bred cunning as well as desperation. She adjusted her scope, searching for the subtle lines of movement, the hints of metal glinting in the sun. Twice she fired, striking wheels, toppling two cannons before they could vanish behind cover. Yet for each she stopped, another slipped from sight, disappearing into folds of earth that her vantage could not pierce. She bit the inside of her cheek, tasting blood, and recalculated. They would regroup, coordinate, and resume their barrage with renewed intensity. She could not allow them the chance. Her hand reached for the radio again, her voice low but urgent, passing coordinates to the few surviving batteries behind her lines. Shift fire, vector 17 by 49, elevation corrected. Interdict movement. Now. The gunners obeyed, their shells landing like iron fists across the hillsides, scattering soil and stone, but she knew it would not be enough. The enemy was adapting too quickly. Closer now, the stutter of machine guns rattled through the haze. Scouts were advancing, infantry sent to flush her from her perch. She crouched lower, drawing her cloak of mud-stained canvas tighter, blending with the ruins. Her rifle was a weapon of distance, not close combat, and she had no squad to guard her flanks. If they reached her position, she would be overrun. Still she did not retreat. Her duty was here, her eyes on the horizon, her fire the shield behind which her comrades gathered themselves. She had learned long ago that survival meant nothing if it was bought with cowardice. If the storm resumed, her people would be annihilated. Better she fall than they. That truth steadied her hands as she drew her scope once more to her eye and searched for the faintest glimmer of another muzzle flash. Her comrades had begun to understand. In the trenches, soldiers who only hours before had cowered in despair now looked toward the broken church with a kind of reverence. They did not see her, but they saw the results. The silenced guns, the easing of pressure, the possibility of life where before there had been only death. They began to fight differently. No longer passive, they raised their rifles, fired bursts of defiance, pushed forward to reclaim sections of trench lost in the bombardment. One sergeant, his face streaked with soot, shouted above the chaos, "Hold fast! She's with us. Keep pushing." The cry spread, and though most had never seen her face, the soldiers rallied behind the invisible guardian who spoke through the language of fire. Hope had a shape now, and it was a long barrel gleaming in the smoke. The enemy infantry crept closer, their silhouettes darting between craters and broken masonry. She saw them through her scope, shadows with rifles, helmets bobbing low. She exhaled, shifted her aim from the hills to the nearer threat, and fired. One fell, then another, each shot precise, each death buying her a moment more to focus on the greater storm. But there were too many, and they pressed forward with ruthless determination. Grenades arced through the smoke, exploding against stone, showering her with fragments. She ducked, ears ringing, blood hot against her cheek where a shard had grazed her. Her hands tightened on the rifle. She had not built it for this range, but her skill compensated for the weapon's limitations. Each trigger pull was deliberate, her breathing a metronome against the chaos. Behind her, the few artillery crews who had survived the morning bombardment began to find their rhythm under her guidance. Her coordinates turned their fire from random desperation into surgical strikes. Hillsides erupted in flames, convoys of enemy guns shattered before they could reform. The counter-barrage grew stronger, louder, until for the first time the thunder belonged not only to the enemy. Her comrades cheered as their shells struck home, their voices raw but triumphant. Even amid her own struggle, she heard them, and it steadied her further. She was no longer alone. Her fire had awakened theirs. Still, her body paid the price. Hours of recoil bruised her shoulder, smoke seared her lungs, the sting of shrapnel burned across her skin. Fatigue tugged at her muscles, whispered to her mind that no one person could carry such a burden forever. But she refused surrender. Every breath was discipline, every shot a vow renewed. She thought of the men who had died under the first storm, of the cries still echoing in her memory, of the promise she had made when she first shouldered the rifle, that she would never let chaos have the final word. If she stopped, the storm would rise again. So she fired and fired, until the rifle's barrel glowed faintly, until the pile of spent casings beside her was a small mountain of brass and steel. The enemy infantry faltered. The closer they pressed, the more of them fell. They had come to silence her, but they discovered that every approach was a death sentence. Their advance slowed, then broke, men crawling back through the smoke, dragging wounded, abandoning the assault. She exhaled long and steady, her scope sweeping back to the horizon where the last of the hidden guns prepared to unleash their fury again. She could see them now, faint outlines in the hills, and though her body trembled with exhaustion, she steadied her aim. One more push, she told herself. One more storm to break. And then, perhaps, silence. The lull was an illusion. She knew it even before the horizon began to flicker again. The enemy had not surrendered their fire. They had only gathered it, drawing their remaining guns together for one last hammer blow. The earth trembled with a deeper, heavier rhythm, the kind that announced the presence of siege cannons, monsters too vast to be silenced with a single shot. These were weapons meant to level fortresses, to erase cities, and now they were turning their maws toward the broken village where she crouched. Through her scope she saw their bulk rising from behind the slopes, dragged by machines, crews swarming over them to feed the vast barrels. The earlier barrage had been terror. This would be annihilation. Her heart beat faster, not with fear but with the clarity of finality. This was the moment the battle hinged upon. If she could stop them, her comrades would live. If she failed, nothing would remain but ruins. She forced her breath steady, wiped blood from her cheek, and adjusted the dials on her scope. Distance, wind, elevation. Each number flickered in her mind, calculated against the shape of the enemy's machines. She remembered the months of training, the endless hours spent mapping angles, studying mechanics, preparing for the day when she would have to fight not only soldiers but the gods of war themselves. Now they stood before her, massive, immovable, daring her to challenge them. She whispered the numbers into her radio, coordinates carried through static to the last loyal batteries behind her lines. Concentrate fire. Target sectors 4 and 5. Immediate. Even as she spoke, her finger curled against the trigger and the rifle cracked. The first shot tore through a crewman, the second struck a loader's arm, and the third shattered the sighting equipment on one of the massive guns. It was not enough to silence them, but it was enough to disrupt, to delay, to force hesitation into the hands of men who had thought themselves invincible. The reply came swift and merciless. The siege cannons roared, their shells arcing high, blotting the sky before crashing into the earth with the force of small earthquakes. The ground heaved, trenches collapsed, men were flung like rag dolls. One shell struck the church itself, tearing away half the remaining spire and burying her in dust and rubble. For a moment she could not breathe, her lungs clogged with grit, her ears ringing with the aftermath of the detonation. She clawed her way free, dragging her weapon from the wreckage, coughing blood into her sleeve. The rifle's barrel was scratched, its scope smeared with grime, but it still functioned. She pressed it to her shoulder, forced her blurred eyes back into focus and fired again. The recoil jarred her bruised bones, but she did not falter. Pain was nothing compared to silence. If she could bring silence, it would be worth any wound. Her comrades watched in awe and terror. They had seen the siege shells land, had believed no one could survive such fire, yet her shots still cracked through the smoke. Each one was a beacon, proof that she endured. Their courage surged with hers. Soldiers who had been half buried dug themselves out, shouting, rallying their neighbors. Officers pointed toward the horizon, directing their men with new fire in their voices. The trenches no longer felt like graves, they became ramparts of defiance. Every time her rifle spoke, the defenders lifted their own weapons higher, their fire rattling back across the battlefield. She had become their anchor, their proof that resistance was not only possible but alive, standing unbroken amid the ruin. The enemy gunners, enraged, poured everything they had at her position. Shells cratered the ground, flames licked through the ruins, machine gun tracers stitched the smoke. She moved like a shadow through the wreckage, never lingering in one place, shifting her aim, firing, vanishing, reappearing elsewhere. Her cloak was tattered, her body battered, but her movements remained precise, her shots unwavering. One by one she picked apart the crews of the siege cannons, forcing replacements to scramble into place, sowing confusion among the enemy ranks. She was no longer just a sniper, she was disruption given form, chaos turned against its masters. Her radio crackled, a voice breaking through amid the static. "We see them." Adjusting fire. Then the thunder came, not from the enemy this time but from behind her lines. Her coordinates had taken root. The surviving batteries unleashed their barrage, shells screaming across the sky to hammer into the enemy's heavy guns. One siege cannon collapsed in a cloud of smoke and twisted metal, its bulk splitting like kindling under the impact. Another staggered, its crew cut down before they could reload. The tide was shifting again, visibly, undeniably. For the first time, the storm that had begun at dawn faltered under the weight of her precision and the courage it had inspired. Yet victory was not without cost. She was bleeding freely now, her side torn by shrapnel, her breath ragged from smoke and strain. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she gritted her teeth and carried on. She thought of nothing beyond the next shot, the next coordinate, the next silence she could carve from the thunder. Around her, the battlefield roared, but within her there was only stillness, the steady rhythm of discipline that had carried her this far. She had no illusions about survival. Whether she lived or died mattered little compared to whether the guns fell quiet. That was her purpose, her vow, and she would see it through to the end. The enemy faltered once more. 2 of their siege cannons lay destroyed, a third crippled, and the survivors hesitated, their crews glancing over their shoulders as though expecting her bullet to find them next. She felt the weight of exhaustion dragging at her limbs, but she steadied her aim again, her finger tightening on the trigger. She had already given more than her body could endure, yet still she pushed because the storm had not yet ended. The artillery had brought chaos and she had sworn that her fire would stop it cold. Smoke boiled across the battlefield like a living thing, curling through the shattered village, seeping into every crater and trench. The thunder of the great guns had lessened, but the enemy's fury had not. Where shells failed, they sent men. Infantry poured down from the ridges in black waves, bayonets fixed, voices raised in guttural shouts that carried even through the smoke. They came not in stealth this time but in rage, determined to drown her fire beneath sheer numbers. It was a tactic as old as war itself. Overwhelm the single threat, crush the solitary blade that cut too deep. From her perch, she watched them advance, dozens upon dozens, their rifles flashing, their boots churning the broken earth. The sight would have frozen lesser souls, but her expression did not change. Her rifle rose and she began to fire. The first wave collapsed before they closed half the distance, her shots falling with mechanical precision, each trigger pull dropping another body. Yet still they came, stepping over the fallen, driven by orders or desperation or hatred. She shifted targets without pause, her hands moving faster than thought, reloading with practiced speed, scope flicking from one silhouette to the next. Spent casings rained into the rubble at her feet, hot enough to scorch the ground, but she did not flinch. Her rifle had always been a weapon of patience, a sniper's tool meant for carefully chosen shots, but now it became a scythe, sweeping down men as they surged forward. Her shoulders screamed with each recoil, the bruise deepening into agony, but her discipline overpowered the pain. She was no longer one woman, she was the line itself, the final barrier between her comrades and annihilation. In the trenches, her comrades saw the black tide advancing and knew their own survival hung by a thread. But when they saw the flashes from the broken church, heard the crack of her rifle again and again, their fear transformed into fury. They rose from the dirt, rifles leveled, and joined their fire to hers. Bullets poured into the oncoming wave, ripping gaps into its ranks. Machine guns rattled from hastily fortified emplacements, mortars thumped, grenades arced overhead. What had been a scattered, broken defense now moved with unity, their courage welded together by the example of one. The defenders were outnumbered, exhausted, half buried by the earlier storm, yet they stood. They stood because she stood. The enemy charge reached the outskirts of the village, bodies pressing through alleys choked with smoke and rubble. She shifted position, crawling through debris to a new vantage point, never allowing herself to remain fixed for long. Bullets whipped past her, stitching sparks into stone. Twice she felt the sting of near misses, once she was slammed flat by the concussion of a grenade, but each time she rose again, rifle steady, scope clear. The world narrowed into a tunnel of focus, target, breath, trigger, silence. Her wounds burned, her lungs rasped, but her will held. Where others saw chaos, she saw patterns, the shape of an enemy squad weaving between ruins, the angle of a bayonet flashing in smoke, the rhythm of boots striking the dirt. Each pattern ended in a shot, each shot in another corpse crumpling to the earth. The radio crackled at her side, an officer's voice strained but alive. "Hold them. Reinforcements are moving. Just hold." She did not answer, her attention too fixed, her energy too precious to waste on words. But she heard and she understood. If she could endure a little longer, if she could keep the line intact, salvation might yet come. She clenched her jaw, shifted her rifle and fired again. A captain fell, his men scattering in confusion. She swung left, cutting down a machine gunner before he could set his weapon, then right, dropping the standard bearer whose flag had urged others forward. Each kill was more than survival, it was disruption, unraveling the enemy's will thread by thread. Still they pressed closer. She abandoned long shots for nearer ones, firing down streets where shadows darted between walls. The crack of her rifle echoed like judgment through the ruins, but her ammunition dwindled, each magazine lighter than the last. She counted her rounds, knew the limit approaching but refused despair. If the rifle failed, she would fight with sidearm and knife. She had not endured the storm only to collapse beneath its dying embers. Her comrades needed every breath she had left, and she would give it until the last. Her vow was not survival, it was silence, and silence could not come while these men still lived to shout their war cries. At last the momentum faltered. The black wave broke against the wall of resistance, bodies piling in the streets, cries turning to confusion. Her comrades surged forward, counterattacking with a ferocity born from desperation turned to rage. They drove bayonets into wavering ranks, hurled grenades into clusters, cut down the remnants of squads that had pushed too far. The village, once a tomb, became a battleground reclaimed. Amid it all, she shifted to higher ground, crawling across beams and rubble to watch the rout unfold. Her rifle cracked one last time, cutting down an officer who tried to rally the retreating tide. Then she lowered it, her arms trembling, her breath ragged. For the first time since dawn, the enemy advance had stopped. She sagged against the rubble, sweat and blood streaking her face, her body screaming for rest. But her eyes did not soften. She knew the storm was not finished. The enemy's great guns still loomed on the horizon, crippled but not silent, and until they were broken, the battle could not truly be won. She forced herself upright, pressed her rifle to her shoulder again, and stared once more through the scope. The chaos had been slowed, the tide repelled, but silence was not yet achieved. And until silence came, she would not stop. The horizon glowed with fire, the ridges still vomiting smoke where crippled cannons burned, but among the ruins of the enemy line the last siege guns stood tall, their silhouettes black against the gray sky. They had not unleashed their full fury in the last hour, conserving their shells while their infantry charged. Now, with the tide of men broken and retreating, the machines loomed once more, monstrous and patient. She saw them through her scope, their crews scrambling, shouting, reloading with frantic urgency. They meant to erase everything in one final barrage, to shatter not only the village but the will of the defenders who clung to it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a reminder that her strength was nearly gone, but her eyes sharpened. This was the final storm and she alone could break it. Her shoulder ached as she raised the rifle, The bruise deepened to bone-deep agony, but she ignored it. Her hands moved by instinct now, adjusting the dials, calculating angles. The wind carried grit across her face, the smoke blurred her vision, but she blinked until clarity returned. She saw the crew of the first cannon aligning the barrel, the loader heaving a shell the size of a man's torso into place. She exhaled, pressed finger to trigger and fired. The round struck the loader square in the chest, hurling him backward. Chaos rippled through the crew. A second shot shattered the elevation gear, freezing the barrel mid-tilt. The third tore into the officer shouting orders, silencing his command. The massive cannon stood crippled, unable to fire. She shifted her aim without pause, ignoring the sweat burning into her wounds. The enemy noticed. Shouts rose and rifles turned toward her position. Bullets smacked into stone, sparked against twisted metal, dug into the ground around her. She rolled, pressed herself against rubble, reloaded, shifted vantage. Each movement sent fire through her side where shrapnel had torn her, but she gritted her teeth and forced her body to obey. She had lived in training for this kind of pain, had prepared her mind for the moment when her body would scream surrender. Now, at the edge of collapse, she drew upon that reservoir, pushing past limits that would have broken others. She rose again, scope to eye, and fired at the second cannon. Her first round dropped a gunner, the second pierced the breech, the third detonated an exposed shell. Flame engulfed the emplacement, smoke billowing upward as men fled shrieking. The second giant was silenced in fire. In the trenches, her comrades erupted in cheers, voices raw but triumphant. They had seen the impossible twice now, and belief spread like lightning. "She's breaking them," they shouted. "The guns are falling." Even the officers paused, their faces pale not with fear but with awe. They had sent reports, they had relayed her coordinates, but none of them had truly believed one woman could alter the fate of an entire front. Yet here she was, standing alone against the gods of war, and the gods were falling. Soldiers rose higher in their trenches, firing with renewed ferocity, driving back the scattered infantry that still lingered near the village. Every crack of her rifle was echoed by their defiance, her will becoming their shield. But the enemy refused to yield easily. The last cannon loomed, its crew larger, more disciplined, its bulk braced against the slope. This one was their pride, their strongest weapon, and they guarded it with squads of riflemen who scoured the hills for her silhouette. Fire rained down upon her perch, grenades thudding into nearby ruins, whole walls collapsing around her. Dust filled her lungs, shards bit into her flesh, and at last a bullet found her arm, tearing through muscle and leaving blood soaking into her sleeve. She staggered, nearly dropping the rifle, her vision swimming. For a moment, the temptation of collapse whispered in her ear. She had done enough, more than anyone could have demanded. She had silenced so many. Could she not let the last one go? No. The word burned in her mind, brighter than the pain. No. If the last cannon fired, it would undo everything. Her comrades would be crushed, their hope obliterated in one final storm. She pressed her wound against her chest, steadied the rifle with trembling hands, and forced herself back into position. Through the scope, she saw the barrel rising, the shell being rammed into place, the officer raising his hand to signal the strike. Time seemed to slow, every detail etched into her mind, the curl of smoke, the gleam of steel, the fear hiding in the eyes of the crew who already suspected what was coming. She exhaled, steadying her heartbeat, her finger tightening. The first shot pierced the officer's skull, spraying the men beside him. The second tore through the loader's spine. She shifted, ignoring the pain blazing through her arm, and fired again, striking the cannon's sighting mechanism. Still the crew persisted, scrambling to adjust, shouting frantically. She fired a fourth time, the round striking the exposed fuse line, sparks leaping. The cannon shuddered, fire racing along its side. She barely had time to dive for cover before the explosion erupted. A blast so massive it flattened nearby men and sent a column of flames spiraling into the sky. The ground shook, the smoke roared upward, and the last of the enemy's great guns split apart, collapsing in ruin. For a heartbeat, silence followed. Real silence, not the pauses between barrages but the absence of thunder. The earth no longer quaked, the air no longer shrieked. Only the crackle of burning wreckage remained. She lay among the rubble, gasping, her body finally rebelling, refusing to rise. Blood soaked her sleeve, pain blurred her thoughts, yet she smiled faintly. The storm had ended. She had promised silence, and silence had come. Her comrades saw the final explosion and knew. A roar rose from the trenches, not of fear but of triumph, thousands of voices crying out at once. They surged forward, chasing the retreating enemy, their rifles blazing, their banners rising. The defenders who had cowered at dawn now became the avengers of dusk, driving the invaders back across the broken fields. And all of it began with one woman, one rifle, one vow. She did not hear their cheers, her ears still ringing from the blast, but she felt the change in the air. The storm had passed. The chaos had been stopped cold. Smoke drifted across the ruined fields and thick curtains turning the world into a gray haze where only silhouettes moved, men staggering, shouting, clutching weapons as they pressed their advantage. The last cannon's explosion still echoed in the bones of the earth, a thunder that had rolled away and left only silence behind. She lay half buried in rubble, every breath dragging fire through her lungs, every nerve screaming with exhaustion. The rifle rested beside her, its barrel scorched, its stock cracked, as battered as the hands that clung to it. For long moments she did not move. Her body had reached its limit. Yet even in that stillness, her spirit pulsed, knowing she had done what she had sworn to do. The guns no longer thundered. The chaos had been silenced. Voices broke through the ringing in her ears, at first distant, then closer, rising above the clamor of the battlefield. Footsteps crunched over stone. Shapes emerged from the haze, the familiar uniforms of her comrades, their faces streaked with dirt and blood but lit with awe. "She's here," one of them cried. "We found her." Another dropped to his knees beside her, hands trembling as he checked her wounds. She tried to push herself up, but her arm failed, collapsing under her weight. A soldier slipped his arm around her shoulders, steadying her. She wanted to protest, to insist she could stand on her own, but the truth pressed down on her chest like an iron weight. She had poured everything into those final shots. Her body was no longer hers to command. She allowed them to lift her, every motion sending jolts of agony through her frame, but she clenched her jaw and endured. As they carried her back toward the lines, she saw the field stretched before her, littered with wreckage and corpses. The enemy was in full retreat, their formations shattered, their banners abandoned in the mud. Fires burned where their guns had once stood, sending black columns spiraling into the sky. Her comrades surged forward, no longer afraid, no longer desperate. They fought with the strength of victors now, their voices raised not in despair but in triumph. She watched them and a faint smile curved her lips. The tide had turned, not because of reinforcements or miracles from above, but because she had stood her ground when all others faltered. That thought steadied her even as her vision swam. They brought her into the trench lines, where medics rushed forward, stripping away her torn uniform, binding wounds with hurried efficiency. She hissed as the bandages tightened, the sting of antiseptic searing her flesh, but she held her silence, refusing to give them the satisfaction of hearing her cry out. Around her, men and women pressed close, their eyes wide, their whispers carrying in the smoky air. Some removed their helmets in respect, others bowed their heads as though she were no longer simply a comrade but something greater, a legend born in their midst. She heard fragments of their words: "She stopped the storm, she broke the cannons, she saved us all." She wanted to dismiss them, to remind them she was only a soldier like any other, but the look in their eyes told her the truth. They needed more than survival. They needed a symbol. And in that moment she had become one. The officers arrived, their coats still pristine compared to the bloodied grunts, their faces taut with both relief and disbelief. They saluted her, a gesture rare between ranks so far apart. The commanding major spoke, his voice thick. "What you accomplished here, there are no words. You've done what artillery, what whole battalions could not. You've given us a chance to hold this front, perhaps even to win this war." She met his gaze, her expression hard. "I didn't do it for medals," she rasped, her voice raw from smoke and shouting. "I did it because they needed silence. They needed peace. If the guns had lived, they would have died." The major nodded slowly, chastened, understanding that she had not fought for glory or command but for something simpler and fiercer, the will to protect. As night fell, the battlefield quieted. The enemy had withdrawn beyond the hills, leaving behind their dead and their broken machines. Fire still crackled, casting shifting shadows across the trenches. She lay on a stretcher near the command post, her wounds bound, her rifle propped within reach. Though her body longed for sleep, her mind remained awake, tracing the memories of each shot, each life taken, each thunder silenced. The faces of the fallen haunted her, not just the enemy gunners but the comrades who had bled beside her, who would never rise again. Victory did not erase the cost. For every cheer, there was a cry of grief somewhere on the field. For every life she saved, another had been lost. That weight pressed heavier than her wounds. Yet even beneath the sorrow, a fire remained. She had seen what one person's will could achieve, how determination sharper than steel could alter the fate of thousands. She did not see herself as a hero, but she could not deny that others did. Already the men whispered her name like a prayer, already stories spread faster than the smoke that still lingered. Tomorrow perhaps bards would weave it into legend, commanders would use it to inspire recruits, children would repeat it in hushed voices. She could not control that. But she could decide how to carry it. And she resolved then that if she lived, if her wounds healed, she would continue, not for fame, not for command, but to ensure that the silence she had bought today would endure tomorrow. The morning after the battle dawned slowly, a pale sun rising behind veils of smoke that still hung over the valley. The land bore the scars of devastation, craters gouged into the soil, shattered guns smoldering, bodies laid out in rows waiting for burial. The air was heavy with the mingled stench of ash, blood, and damp earth, a reminder of what the night had brought. Yet, in the midst of ruin there was quiet, the kind of quiet soldiers scarcely remembered after weeks of bombardment. For the first time in months, no thunder of artillery split the dawn. She opened her eyes to that silence and felt the weight of its meaning press into her chest. Her body ached, her wounds burned beneath the fresh bandages, but the absence of the guns was like a balm. She had promised them silence and she had delivered. The medics urged her to rest, but she refused to remain still. With the help of a crutch fashioned from a broken rifle stock, she limped through the camp, her comrades parting to let her pass. Their eyes followed her, filled with gratitude, awe, and something deeper, faith. Men who had once been broken, trembling under relentless fire, now stood straighter, their voices louder, their movements sure. They no longer looked beaten. She had given them back their courage, and she carried that knowledge heavily, aware that they would draw strength from her whether she wished it or not. Each step sent pain lancing through her body, but she bore it, unwilling to let them see her falter. Symbols could not limp. Symbols had to stand even when flesh begged for rest. At the edge of the trenches, she looked out across the fields where the enemy had once advanced. The broken guns jutted from the earth like the bones of giants, their barrels twisted, their crews dead or fled. Birds circled above, hesitant to return to a place still thick with smoke, but they would come eventually. Grass would grow again in the craters. The earth would heal, though slowly. She wondered if her own heart could do the same. The faces of the dead lingered, flickering behind her eyes, the comrades she could not save, the enemy she had killed with ruthless precision. Every pull of the trigger had been necessary, but necessity did not lighten the weight. She touched the cracked stock of her rifle, still propped beside her, and whispered to it as though it were alive, "We did what had to be done." The commanding major approached her there, his expression solemn. "We've sent word to headquarters," he said. "They'll want to honor you for this. Medals, promotions, your name etched in the records." She turned her gaze to him, steady and sharp. "And will that bring back the ones who didn't make it?" she asked quietly. The major faltered, words dying in his throat. He finally bowed his head. "No," he admitted. "But it may remind others of what one soldier can do." She sighed, the sound weary. "Then tell them the truth," she said. "Tell them it wasn't one soldier. Tell them it was desperation, it was courage, it was the refusal to surrender. Tell them it was all of us." The major nodded, humbled, and left her to the silence she had fought so hard to win. As the days passed, the story spread beyond the camp. Couriers carried it to neighboring regiments, to distant fronts, to towns and villages where weary civilians prayed for hope. They told of a lone sharpshooter who silenced the enemy's artillery, who turned the tide with her rifle and her will. The tale grew with every telling, her feat magnified until she was more myth than woman. Yet in the camp, among those who had seen it with their own eyes, the truth remained raw and real. They remembered the thunder, the smoke, the sight of her standing when no one else could, and they carried that memory like a shield against despair. She watched it spread and wondered what would remain when the war was over. Would she be remembered as a savior, or forgotten as another soldier swallowed by history's hunger? On the 7th night after the battle, she sat alone by the edge of the field, the stars clear now that the smoke had thinned. The rifle rested across her knees, and she traced the scars along its length, her fingers lingering on the cracks and burns. The war was not over. She knew the enemy would return with new guns, new thunder. She could not silence them forever. But she had proven that fire could be answered with fire, that chaos could be met with resolve. She had shown that one person's will, sharpened by necessity, could change the course of battle. That truth mattered more than medals, more than titles. It was the truth that would live in the hearts of those who fought beside her, long after her body healed or failed. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, the night air cool in her lungs. For now there was peace. Fragile, fleeting but real. Tomorrow the war would resume, and she would take her place once more, not because she sought glory but because silence was worth fighting for. She had seen what chaos did, how it tore men apart, how it turned hope to ash. She had faced it and she had stopped it cold. That was her burden, her gift, her curse. And though the war would ask for more, though the world would demand again and again, she would rise. For as long as she could lift her rifle, as long as she could steady her hands, she would answer the call. The artillery had fallen silent, but her war was not yet done. The end.